presentation, we're going to talk about your exposure, how to put it all together. What is exposure? Exposure is the process of recording the image. It's the balancing act between your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO. It lets in just the right amount of light to take a good image. So we've already talked about what the shutter does, what the aperture does, and what the ISO do on their own, but now we're going to talk about how to take all three of those things and put them together, okay? And you have to use all three of those things to balance the light. It's all about controlling all three things, all three parts, and it's all about knowing which part to change and when to change it. And if you change it incorrectly, if you have too much light, you'll be overexposed. And if you have not enough light, you'll be underexposed and your picture will be too dark. So we're looking for the correct amount of light in the picture. So let's talk more about it. Now, lucky for you, your camera has this thing that is internal that's called the light meter. And what it does is it actually reads the amount of light in front of your camera. And it tells you whether you have enough light or not enough light or too much light. Every camera has this device internally, right? Yeah, I just said all of those points, didn't I? I did. There they are. This is an example on the right-hand side of the very top one is a correctly exposed meter. Now you'll see the little rectangle underneath the meter, and that one is right in the middle, so that means that it has the right amount of light. The one underneath that says it's underexposed, and the little rectangle is over towards the -2, which is telling you that you don't have enough light. On the very bottom one, it's overexposed, and the little rectangle is towards the +2, which means you have too much light. What a light meter looks like. A light meter can be a scale with a 0 in the middle and a plus and a minus on the ends, on either end, or a negative or positive number on either end. It can also just be a negative or a positive number without a 0, and maybe there's not a scale in the middle. I have cameras that do that. Or back in the old days, it used to be like a metal pin that was on the side, like when you look into the viewfinder of your camera, there would be a metal pin on the side, and it would actually move back and forth, and you'd have to get it to stay in the middle, which was really hard to do. So what I want to do right now is I want to show you what that looks like. What an actual light meter looks like on one of our digital cameras. So this is one of our Nikon digital cameras. This is the D3200. This is N7. And this is what it looks like. If I turn it on manual mode, this is what the back looks like, see? So here I'm seeing my shutter. Here, f-stop, remember f-stop is your aperture, right? And underneath that, you have your light meter. On a Nikon camera, you have a 0 in the middle, a plus on the right, and a negative on the left. Notice it keeps going out because if you don't touch it for long enough, it turns off to save battery. Oh, that was like magic. Did you see that? I did that just right in time. But that's your light meter. That's what it looks like right there, okay? Let's go to our next slide and see what else we're going to talk about here. Okay, understanding exposure. You must balance your aperture and your shutter to get the correct exposure. If one is letting in a lot of light, the other one must not let in a lot of light. Simply change your aperture and your shutter until the meter reads 0, but think about how and why you're moving them. Drives me nuts when high school kids just start moving dials back and forth without thinking about why they're moving them. So let's think that through for a second. If you have an aperture of a 1.4, which means that your aperture is way open, like it's really, really, really wide open, and it's letting in a ton of light, right? You have to have a shutter that is faster so that it doesn't let in a lot of light. If you have an aperture that's letting in a lot of light and a shutter that's letting in a lot of light also, then you're going to have a photograph that's overexposed, that has way too much light in it. So you have to balance those two things, okay? Your ISO will affect your exposure as well. If your ISO is set to a lower number, you will need more light to perfectly expose your image. If it's set to a higher number, you will not need as much light. I'm going to give you examples of this once we start our example project, and it will make a lot more sense to you then, okay? So here's what I want to show you. I want to show you what happens when we change these things, okay? So here we have it, okay? Now, right now my shutter is at 160, my aperture is at f5, and it's telling me, it's changing because it reads the light in front of it, right? So it's telling me I have too much light. See where my little scale there keeps moving back and forth, but it's all towards the positive, right? Because it's reading the light in front of me. If I move my camera around, it reads different amounts of light, right? There we go. Okay. Now look what happens if I take my hand and I put it in front of my lens. I just blocked out all the light, and now my light meter is telling me that I do not have enough light. I move my hand away from the lens, and it tells me I have enough light. Now, if I have too much light, I could do two things here. I can either close down my aperture, and we do that on this camera. You don't have to worry about this yet because we're not using the cameras, but we do that on this camera like this. Close down my aperture, which you notice the little visual over here closes down, and now I'm at an f8 and I'm at 0, right? I'm going to put that back to the f5 that it was at before. Maybe even there. Yeah. I can also take my shutter, and I can move my shutter button, which is here. Sorry, it's really hard to do through the iPad. And as I move my shutter, it will also change my exposure on my light meter, right? At 125 and f5, I'm at 0, and I can take a perfectly exposed picture. Now, that would change if I move my camera and I'm pointing like this way, because I'm pointing at different light, right? It takes a minute for high school kids to get that concept that, like, you can, a lot of people will try to set their camera, and it's natural to point the camera downward so you can see the back of the camera as you're setting it. And then they set it so that it's at perfect exposure, and then they lift it back up to take a picture, and then their exposure is all messed up because it reads the light in front of you and it constantly changes, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is the effects of exposure on your image. A correctly exposed image has just the right amount of light, but it also has a good range of value. Value in photography is the range of shadows, highlights, and midtones in a picture. Think about a black and white picture. In a good black and white picture, you have very black blacks, you have very white whites, and you have many shades of gray in between. So that's your value, and this is a value scale underneath here, right? Your little value scale. So yeah, value. And you get value in colored photographs as well. It's just easy to think about a black and white picture. Underexposure. Underexposure is when there's not enough light in the image, making it too dark. You lose the details in the shadowy areas. So check out this picture over here. You can see the bright lights and you can see parts of it, but there's parts of this image that are so dark that you can't see a thing and you lose all the detail. That's an underexposed image. An overexposed image is when there's too much light in the image, making it too bright. You lose all the detail in the highlight areas, all the white areas. Like check out this, that's a fish tank that she's dropping something into right there. And that fish tank is what we call blown out. It is just white. There's no information there. There's nothing to pull back. I can't even edit this image to make it any good. Now, in photography, we always have this rule that says, if you're going to do anything, go darker. Right? Go darker with your image, because if I have a darker image, I can sometimes pull back information. But if I have a lighter image, there's nothing there to pull back. There's actually no information there to pull back, right? Now, once you get really good at this exposure thing, you can start over and underexposing just a little bit and make some really cool effects, right? Like if you want your the dark areas of your photograph to be really dark and inky, you can underexpose a little bit. Or if you want like clouds in the sky to pop, you can overexpose a little bit, right? But not yet. Right now, the only thing you are concerned about as beginner Photo 1 students is getting your exposure perfect. Here's something that we do a lot in photography when we're starting out, or when we're practicing, or when we just want to make sure we have a really good exposure. It's called bracketing. Bracketing, when you take a picture and you're bracketing, it's the process of creating a series of exposures of the same image with different values. So you would go to take your picture, right? You set yourself all up, and you would perfectly expose your picture and take the picture, and then you would overexpose it a little bit. Not a ton, just a little bit, and take the picture. And then you would underexpose it a little bit and take the picture, right? And then what you have is 3 photographs to choose from, 3 photographs to edit from, 3 photographs to like maybe even potentially down the road put together and make into one image, which is really cool to do. And sometimes you like the over or the underexposed photograph better than the perfectly exposed photograph. You never know. And it's just really, really, really good practice. Okay? And it always guarantees that you have at least one image that's really good to work with. Okay? So, ladies and gentlemen, that is exposure. That is how we take the 3 parts of your camera and put them all together.